At first, it looked like a fight over music streaming, a disagreement about subscriptions, a dispute over fees. Just another corporate conflict inside the technology industry. But behind the public statements, legal complaints, and carefully worded press releases, something much bigger was happening. One of the world's most powerful companies controlled the devices. The other controlled the service that millions of people used every day. One owned the ecosystem, the other depended on access to it. And as both companies grew larger, their interests began to collide. For years, Spotify and Apple appeared to operate in the same digital world. Millions of iPhone users listened to music through Spotify. Apple sold the hardware. Spotify provided the experience. On the surface, the relationship seemed simple. It was anything but simple. As streaming transformed the music industry, Spotify became the dominant platform in a market it had helped create. It changed how people discovered songs, built playlists, and consumed music. The company expanded across continents and attracted hundreds of millions of users. But despite its scale, Spotify faced a reality that would define its future. It did not control the platform on which many of its customers lived. Apple did. Every subscription purchased through an iPhone, every app update, every customer relationship that passed through the App Store. Apple stood at the gate. And Apple was not just the gatekeeper, it was also a competitor. When Apple launched its own music streaming service, the balance changed. The company that controlled access to the ecosystem was now competing directly with one of the most successful businesses operating inside it. What had once been a partnership of convenience started to resemble something very different: a struggle over power. Spotify argued that the rules of the App Store created an uneven playing field.
Apple argued that its policies applied equally to everyone. Regulators entered the conversation. Lawsuits followed. Governments began asking questions that reached far beyond music. Who should control access to digital markets? Can the owner of a platform compete fairly against the companies that depend on it? And what happens when a single ecosystem becomes so influential that entire businesses cannot afford to leave it? What started as a dispute between two technology giants gradually became one of the most important battles in the modern digital economy. Because this was never just about playlists, subscriptions, or streaming music. It was about control. Control over customers, control over distribution, control over the rules of an entire ecosystem. And as this conflict expanded from boardrooms to courtrooms and eventually to governments around the world, it exposed a question that could shape the future of every major technology company.
In the digital age, who really holds the power? The company that creates the product or the company that owns the gate? To understand how Spotify and Apple ended up in a battle over power, it is necessary to go back to a time when neither company was fighting over streaming at all. The real story began during a period when the music industry itself was struggling to survive a technological revolution. For decades, the business model of recorded music had been relatively simple. Consumers bought physical products, first vinyl records, then cassettes, then compact discs. Record labels controlled distribution, retailers sold the product, and artists generated revenue through sales. The system was imperfect, but it was stable. Then the internet changed everything. Digital files made music infinitely easier to copy, share, and distribute. Peer-to-peer services allowed millions of users to access songs without paying for them. Piracy exploded across the world. Consumers embraced convenience, while the music industry watched this traditional business model weaken year after year. The challenge was obvious. People still wanted music. In many ways, they wanted more music than ever before. But they no longer wanted to buy albums the way previous generations had. The industry needed a new model, one that could compete with free access while still generating revenue. That opportunity would eventually create Spotify. The company entered a market where consumer behavior had already changed. Instead of fighting against digital distribution, Spotify embraced it. The idea was simple but powerful. Rather than purchasing individual songs or albums, users could gain access to an enormous library of music through a subscription. Instant access became more important than ownership. For consumers, the value was clear. Millions of songs were available from a single application.
Music could be discovered, organized, and shared in ways that physical media had never allowed. Instead of managing collections, users could simply press play. The model was not immediately guaranteed to succeed. Licensing agreements with record labels were complex. Profitability remained a challenge. Many industry executives remained skeptical about whether streaming could replace traditional revenue sources. But consumer demand continued to move in one direction: toward convenience, toward access, toward digital ecosystems. At the same time, another company was building an entirely different kind of empire. Long before streaming became dominant, Apple had already transformed the music business once. The iPod changed how people carried music. The iTunes Store changed how they purchased it. Apple proved that technology companies could reshape entire industries by controlling both hardware and software at the same time. This strategy would become one of the defining strengths of the company. Apple did not simply create products, it created ecosystems. Its devices, operating systems, services, and digital marketplaces were designed to work together. Customers who entered the ecosystem often stayed inside it. The experience was seamless, convenient, and highly profitable. As smartphones became the center of modern digital life, Apple gained something even more valuable than hardware sales. It gained control over access. The launch of the App Store created a new marketplace where developers could reach hundreds of millions of users. Companies large and small suddenly depended on Apple's platform to distribute software, acquire customers, and generate revenue. For many businesses, the arrangement made perfect sense. Apple provided the infrastructure, security, payment systems, and global reach. In exchange, developers accepted the rules of the ecosystem. During these early years, Spotify was one of the many companies benefiting from this arrangement. The relationship appeared mutually beneficial. Spotify gained access to a massive audience of iPhone users. Apple gained another high-quality application that made its devices more attractive. Neither side appeared destined for conflict. But beneath the surface, both companies were moving toward the same destination. Spotify was becoming one of the most important music platforms in the world. Apple was expanding beyond hardware and deeper into digital services. As streaming continued replacing ownership, music was no longer just a feature inside Apple's ecosystem, it was becoming a strategic business. And when two powerful companies begin depending on the same customers, the same subscriptions, and the same source of revenue, cooperation can slowly transform into competition. The stage for conflict was already being built long before either company openly acknowledged it. The music industry had created a new opportunity. Smartphones had become the primary gateway to digital life, and two ambitious companies were moving toward the same market from opposite directions. The collision was no longer a question of if, it was becoming a question of when. Once the streaming model proved it could attract listeners at scale, Spotify entered a phase that would transform it from an ambitious startup into one of the most influential companies in the music industry. The challenge was no longer convincing people that streaming could work. The challenge was becoming the platform that defined how streaming worked. Spotify moved aggressively. Its library expanded, its recommendation systems improved, its playlists became a powerful tool for music discovery. The company focused relentlessly on user experience, making it easier to find songs, build collections, and explore new artists. Music was no longer something people purchased occasionally.
It became a service that existed everywhere, available at any moment.
This shift changed consumer behavior on a massive scale. For decades, listeners had built personal collections. They owned albums, CDs, digital downloads, and carefully organized libraries. Spotify offered something different. Instead of ownership, it offered access. Instead of choosing what to buy, users could explore virtually unlimited catalogs for a monthly fee. The convenience was difficult to resist. As smartphones became the primary device for consuming digital content, Spotify was perfectly positioned to benefit. People listened during commutes, workouts, workdays, flights, and late-night hours at home. Music became more integrated into daily life than ever before. The more people used Spotify, the more valuable the platform became. Data began driving the experience. Listening habits generated insights. Recommendations became increasingly personalized.
Playlists such as Discover Weekly helped users find music they might never have encountered otherwise. The platform was no longer simply distributing songs. It was shaping listening behavior itself. Growth accelerated. Millions became tens of millions. Tens of millions became hundreds of millions. Spotify expanded into market after market, establishing itself as the leading name in music streaming. Competitors existed, but few matched its scale, brand recognition, or user engagement. In many ways, Spotify had achieved something remarkable. It had become the default choice for streaming music. For younger audiences especially, Spotify was often the first service that came to mind when discussing digital music. Its green logo became instantly recognizable. Artists wanted visibility on the platform. Record labels needed access to its audience. Users invested years building playlists, preferences, and listening histories. This created a powerful form of loyalty. Switching platforms was possible, but not always convenient. Music libraries represented years of personal habits and emotional connections. Every saved album, favorite artist, and curated playlist increased the cost of leaving. Spotify was building more than a customer base. It was building an ecosystem of its own. Meanwhile, Apple was experiencing a different transformation. The iPhone had become one of the most successful consumer products in history. The App Store was thriving. Apple users spent heavily on digital services and applications. The company's ecosystem continued expanding far beyond hardware. This success created an important strategic question. If streaming represented the future of music consumption, why should Apple allow another company to dominate that future? Apple had already changed the music industry once through the iPod and iTunes. It understood the importance of music not only as a source of revenue, but also as a tool for strengthening customer loyalty. Music helped keep users connected to devices, software, and services, allowing Spotify to become the primary music experience for hundreds of millions of consumers carried risks. Every minute spent inside Spotify was a minute spent inside someone else's ecosystem. Eventually, Apple decided to move directly into the streaming business. The launch of Apple Music fundamentally altered the competitive landscape. Unlike many new entrants, Apple did not need to build an audience from scratch. It already possessed hundreds of millions of customers, enormous financial resources, deep relationships across the music industry, and one of the most valuable ecosystems in the world. Few companies could challenge Spotify. Apple was one of them. Yet even after Apple Music entered the market, Spotify remained the largest streaming platform for years. Its early lead, strong brand identity, and loyal user base provided advantages that could not be replicated overnight.
Consumers often viewed Spotify as the specialist, the company built entirely around streaming. The competition intensified. Both companies invested heavily in improving their services. Both pursued exclusive content strategies at different points. Both sought deeper relationships with artists, labels, and listeners. Streaming was no longer an emerging category. It had become one of the most important battlegrounds in the digital economy. But beneath the visible competition, another reality was taking shape. Spotify and Apple were not competing from equal positions. Spotify's business depended heavily on reaching users through smartphones, particularly the iPhone. Apple, meanwhile, controlled not only a competing music service, but also the platform through which Spotify reached many of its customers. The same company that competed with Spotify also controlled critical parts of the environment in which Spotify operated. For years, rapid growth helped mask this tension. Streaming demand was expanding so quickly that both companies could continue growing. Investors focused on subscriber numbers. Consumers focused on features and playlists. But as both businesses became larger and more important, the underlying conflict became harder to ignore. Spotify had become the dominant force in streaming. Apple had become one of the most powerful gatekeepers in modern technology. And when a dominant platform depends on access controlled by an even larger platform owner, the balance of power can change very quickly. The empire Spotify had built was enormous, but it stood on ground that it did not own. The conflict did not explode overnight. There was no single announcement that suddenly transformed Spotify and Apple into enemies. Instead, the tension accumulated slowly, hidden beneath years of growth, product launches, and corporate diplomacy.
For a long time, both companies continued expanding, and as long as the streaming market kept growing, the underlying problem remained manageable. But growth has a way of hiding structural weaknesses. The more successful Spotify became, the more dependent it became on platforms it did not control. This was the paradox at the center of its business. Spotify had built one of the world's most recognizable consumer brands, yet its ability to reach customers was still tied to ecosystems owned by others. No platform mattered more than Apple's. By this point, the iPhone had become one of the most valuable gateways in the digital economy. Millions of Spotify subscribers accessed the service through Apple devices. Acquiring new users often meant acquiring iPhone users. Maintaining subscriptions often meant operating within Apple's ecosystem, and that ecosystem came with rules. Apple required digital subscriptions purchased through iOS applications to use its payment infrastructure.
Developers that chose this route were generally subject to commissions that became one of the most controversial aspects of the App Store. For many companies, these fees were simply part of doing business. They gained access to Apple's massive audience and accepted the associated costs. For Spotify, the situation was more complicated. Unlike many developers, Spotify was not simply selling software. It was selling an ongoing subscription service with relatively thin margins compared to Apple's broader business model. Every percentage point mattered. Every dollar lost to platform fees affected profitability, pricing flexibility, and long-term competitiveness. The problem became even more sensitive after Apple Music entered the market. Now the owner of the platform was also a direct competitor. From Spotify's perspective, the situation appeared increasingly difficult. If Spotify passed App Store costs to consumers, its subscription could appear more expensive than Apple Music. If it absorbed the cost itself, profitability suffered. Either outcome created pressure. Apple, meanwhile, viewed the issue differently. The company argued that its policies applied across the ecosystem. The App Store required enormous investment to build and maintain. Security, payment systems, software distribution, and developer tools all came at a cost. Apple's position was that the rules were consistent and available to everyone. This disagreement represented more than a dispute about fees. It revealed fundamentally different views about platform power. As the rivalry intensified, Spotify faced a strategic reality it could not easily solve. It had become the market leader in streaming, but it lacked direct control over the infrastructure connecting it to many of its customers. The larger Spotify became, the more important this vulnerability became. At the same time, Apple continued strengthening its ecosystem.
The company's strategy was not built around winning one product category at a time. It was built around making every service more valuable when combined with every other service. Hardware supported software. Software supported services. Services reinforced customer loyalty. The entire ecosystem worked together. Apple Music fit naturally into that vision. For Apple, music streaming was not merely a standalone business. It was another layer in a much larger machine. This difference in strategic positioning created a challenge that Spotify struggled to escape. No matter how successful Spotify became in streaming, Apple possessed advantages that existed beyond streaming itself. The company controlled devices, operating systems, payment systems, app distribution, and customer relationships simultaneously. The battlefield itself belonged to Apple. As years passed, Spotify became increasingly vocal about what it viewed as unfair conditions. Public criticism escalated.
Regulatory complaints followed. The company argued that platform owners should not be allowed to compete directly against businesses dependent on those same platforms. These arguments began attracting attention beyond the technology industry. Governments and regulators around the world were already examining the growing power of large technology companies. Questions about competition, platform neutrality, and market access were becoming impossible to ignore. Spotify's dispute with Apple suddenly looked less like a private corporate disagreement and more like a case study in how digital power functioned in the modern economy. Yet Spotify's own position contained blind spots. The company had spent years building its success inside ecosystems owned by others because doing so had been the fastest path to growth. The strategy was logical. Access to hundreds of millions of smartphone users accelerated adoption and helped establish Spotify as the dominant streaming brand. Few executives would have rejected that opportunity. The trade-off seemed reasonable when Spotify was smaller. Only later did the long-term consequences become fully visible. By the time the company recognized the scale of its dependence, changing course was extraordinarily difficult. Building a global consumer platform was hard. Replacing the smartphone ecosystems through which consumers access digital services was nearly impossible. The imbalance was becoming clearer. Spotify controlled music streaming. Apple controlled the gate. And in technology, control over distribution often proves more powerful than control over the product itself. The turning point came when the dispute stopped being primarily about music and started becoming a fight over the future structure of digital markets. Court filings, regulatory investigations, public statements, and industry debates pushed the conflict into the open. Investors watched. Developers watched. Competitors watched.
Because everyone understood what was really being tested. If Spotify could challenge Apple's control over parts of the ecosystem, it might reshape the relationship between platforms and developers across the entire technology industry. If it failed, the message would be equally significant. The streaming giant that had helped transform music had discovered a hard truth. Building an empire was one thing. Building it on someone else's land was something else entirely. And as the battle moved beyond subscriptions and playlists, the future that Spotify once seemed to control was beginning to slip into a much larger struggle over power itself. The conflict did not produce a dramatic collapse in the traditional sense. Spotify did not disappear. Apple did not retreat. Neither company suffered the kind of downfall seen in many classic business rivalries. Instead, the consequences unfolded in a different way. The battle expanded beyond the two companies themselves and began reshaping the conversation around power in the digital economy. Regulators across multiple regions started paying closer attention to the relationship between platform owners and the businesses operating inside their ecosystems. Questions that once seemed highly technical entered public debate. Should a platform be allowed to compete directly with companies that depend on that platform? Should developers have alternative ways to reach customers? How much control should any single company have over digital distribution? The fight between Spotify and Apple became one of the most visible examples used to examine those questions. In some ways, Spotify achieved something significant even without securing a decisive victory. It succeeded in drawing attention to issues that many developers had quietly discussed for years. What had once been viewed as a dispute involving a music application was now being discussed as a broader question about competition and market access. The pressure created by regulators, lawmakers, and industry scrutiny gradually pushed the debate far beyond streaming. At the same time, Apple largely maintained the foundation of the ecosystem it had spent years building. The company continued generating enormous revenue from hardware, services, and software. The App Store remained one of the most powerful distribution systems in the world. Apple Music continued growing alongside the broader expansion of streaming. This outcome revealed something important. The conflict was never really about whether Spotify could defeat Apple. It was about whether any company operating inside another company's ecosystem could ever possess the same level of power as the ecosystem owner itself. Spotify remained the leading streaming platform in many markets. Its brand remained strong. Its user base continued growing. Yet the company also learned a lesson that many technology businesses eventually discover. Scale and power are not always the same thing. A company can dominate its category and still depend on someone else's infrastructure. A company can influence millions of users and still operate under rules written by another organization. A company can become an empire and still discover that an even larger empire exists above it. The broader market changed as well. Streaming became the default model for music consumption. Physical ownership became increasingly niche. Subscription services expanded across entertainment, software, productivity, gaming, and media. The questions raised by Spotify's conflict with Apple became relevant to countless industries that had little connection to music. Developers watched carefully. Technology companies watched carefully. Governments watched carefully.
Because beneath every debate about commissions, subscriptions, or platform policies was a deeper issue: control. Who controls customer access? Who controls distribution? Who controls the rules? And who has the power to change them? Looking back, the secret war between Spotify and Apple was never truly about music. Music was simply the battlefield where a larger struggle became visible. The real conflict centered on two competing visions of the digital economy. One focused on creating the best service, the other focused on controlling the ecosystem through which services reached users. Both approaches proved extraordinarily successful. Both created immense value. Both helped shape the modern internet. Yet their collision exposed a reality that continues to define the technology industry today. Innovation creates opportunities. Growth creates influence. Success creates power. But the structure of the market often determines who holds that power when competition intensifies.
The story of Spotify and Apple is not the story of a company winning or losing. It is the story of what happens when a rising empire encounters an older empire that controls the roads, the gates, and the territory itself. In technology, the future rarely belongs to the biggest company today. It belongs to the companies that understand where power is moving before everyone else does. Markets change, platforms evolve, dominance can look permanent until the rules shift beneath it. And when that happens, even the strongest empires can discover that their greatest vulnerability was hidden inside the foundation of their success. If you want more stories about the rise and fall of the companies that shaped our world, subscribe to Inside Tech Empires.